One of the things as MC you always got to learn is the people you really need to talk to, and that's Lois Schreiner. And Lois runs this. We all know how important Lois is, and Lois gave me a couple announcements. If you did sign in to the registration desk and you did not get one of those parking strips, they're still there. So we have paid parking for you. Please pick that up if you haven't. Next up on our program, I'm very, very pleased, honored to introduce our next speaker. You know, one of the major strengths of our swine program is the team approach across lots of disciplines. And a strong relationship with our College of Veterinary Medicine and the faculty there is key to that. Next on our program is Dr. Mike Apley. Dr. Apley is Professor of Production Medicine and Clinical Pharmacology. He received his DVM and PhD from Kansas State University, and he's a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Pharmacology. I could have spent the whole introduction listing Dr. Apley's awards, but he has been widely recognized for his leadership in animal health and food safety, and no one said it better than Dr. Dan Upson. Dr. Apley has provided tremendous service to the livestock industry as we wrestle with the challenges of pharmacology, food safety, and the changes in the regulatory issue that's upon us. Recently, Mike represented NCBA at the White House Forum on Antibiotic Stewardship. He's at the forefront of the current debates on antibiotic use, and we are so fortunate at Kansas State to have Mike's common sense approach to these discussions on this issue. He is in high demand, but always takes time to help us out. To present Countdown to the new feed directive, what do we need to know? Please welcome Dr. Mike Apley.
Thank you, Dr. Nichols. I think I need to have you talk to my wife. Kind of burned a few husband points lately and kind of need some deposits in that account. All right. Can't help me there? I bet you can. Move it up, all right. There, good, all right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to K-State. For those of you who traveled in, glad to see you here. So we've got some time here to talk about this. I'm going to run through some slides and then I'm up for questions. And if you have comments, questions, or outright rebuttals, jump up at any time. But we're going to go through the feed directive, what it's going to mean to us. And it's different talking to a group that's intimately associated with the swine industry than the beef industry, because you've already worked through with Palmitil. You're aware of, a lot of you have written VFDs that are veterinarians, a lot of you are producers. If you've used that product, you're familiar with some of the VFD process. In other areas of veterinary medicine and food animal production, we're not quite so familiar, so there's a little bit bigger jump. But we're going to talk about where we're going and a little bit of what got us here, because it's the change in the landscape is a lot bigger than just the VFD. We've got a lot of things going on that are pretty exciting. So how did we get here first? How did we get to the point where we're expanding the veterinary feed directive to not only slightly change the rule, but also to change which drugs are under it, to change the relationship of the veterinarian and the producer? Well, I use this slide to put everything in context. Right? I want us to have a context for what we're going to talk about today, and that's antibiotics. So we are only 105 years from when all we had for an antibiotic was an arsenic derivative. Dr. Ehrlich's lab went through the first high-throughput screening process and was looking at different arsenic compounds to find one that would kill bacteria and not quite kill us off. Right? Same concept as putting Vicks all over your chest and making you go to bed. So this was called the arsenic that cures, right? And it was 1910, and another newer version came along in 1912, but 105 years ago, all we had was arsenic. If you were unfortunate enough to come down with a gonorrhea or syphilis, they smeared you with a mercury cream and put you in a sweat box. Right? That's how it went back then. So it was a little rougher. And but I use that to my advantage because the boys pick up a lot of this stuff. So all through their high school years, there was a jar of mercury cream up right there. Their dad knew how to use it, you know, and it worked. It got them through all right. So in 1935, we got the sulfas, right? And in 1942, even though in 1928 penicillin was actually discovered, we all know the story, went on vacation, came back, found the spores, et cetera. But in 1942 is when they actually got to the point of mass producing it. And as a matter of fact, in World War II, German soldiers would surrender if wounded. They were likely to surrender because they knew we had penicillin. They didn't. Both sides had sulfus. So they knew that penicillin could do things that sulfus didn't. So 1942, what are we, like 73 years ago, we really moved into the modern age. And my dad remembers in the mid-50s early 50s when penicillin G showed up on his dad's farm the first time for animals, and the miracle drug it was, and what we were able to do with anything in a calf. It seemed like anything in a calf responded. So that was when we got started. And we got chlorotetracycline in 1948. So we've had CTC since 1948, and in the early 50s was when they first discovered what antibiotics in the feed could do for growth. Early 50s is when that was discovered. There's some classic articles I've been able to get a hold of in some of the trade magazines about discovering what antibiotics could do and alteration in growth characteristics. So it happened not long after that. And then we got chloramphenicol and neomycin both in 49. So before we hit 1950, we had the first of the aminoglycosides, neomycin. We had chloramphenicol, which was used in food animals for a while, and then of course banned because it can cause aplastic anemia in humans. And we had the tetracycline, sulfus, and the first penicillin. And so we were underway. And then we got the first of the macrolides, so tylosin's first relative, in 1952. So we're rocking and rolling. We are stomping on bacteria. In 55, we get vancomycin, which is the first of glycopeptides. That is still the savior today for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. That's the first one. We're starting to see some resistance, but that's the first one we had. The first of the streptogramins, Virginia mycin, Stavac or Vmax in 59. And so by 60 now we got metronidazole, which is prohibited for extra-label use in food animals, used a lot in humans and some in companion animals also. There's your lincosamides. So lincocin, its first relative clindamycin in 68. And here we are in 70, we got the first of the cephalosporins. So a very early relative of ceftiofur, which you'd know is Naxel, Lexinel, Exceed. That was the first of that class. And in 78, we got the fluoroquinolones. So every time we turned around during this time period, it was like, here's another one. Hand me another round, we're going hunting. And so about in the early 80s was when the statement was made, the age of infectious disease is done. We have conquered infectious disease. About the same time, a senior IBM executive made the statement that the worldwide market for the personal computer is 6. Right? My goal in life is to not be recorded saying something like that, but I'm sure I already have been. So when you look at it from 78 back and into the early 80s, we got it. We got this whipped, right? And then about 85, we got the carbapenems. And if you watch the news, you're starting to hear about things like KPC, Klebsiella pneumoniae, which is carbapenem resistant. We've got carbapenem resistance in multiple different organisms around the world. We've got it here in the US, and we got those drugs first in 1985. The carbapenems are of the same big family as the penicillins and the cephalosporins. They're a beta-lactam, but different. And they are, they're a class that when we start to see resistance to those in human medicine, you're like, holy smokes, we're in trouble. And if you're watching the news, you're going to see news feeds today on a new article in The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, documenting resistance in food, swine, and human isolates in China to colistin, which is polymyxin E. Polymyxin B, polymyxin E, same class. Colistin is incredibly nephrotoxic to the kidneys when given systemically, but in some cases in humans now it's the only thing left that still works. So it's a race between getting the infection in your kidneys. And they're now starting to document more resistance to that around the world. And we aren't really using very much of that, if any, but it's being used extensively in some other countries. So, and then we got linezolid and we got cyclic lipopeptides, and those are 2 human ones for gram-positives, and that's really it. You'll notice we had a real nice population in here where it seemed like discovery would never end, and this is the first one for the group. So There's more that have been developed by chemically altering and creating new generations. We've gone through the 5th and we're moving into the 6th generations of cephalosporins. Naxal will be 3rd. And we keep rocking and rolling with those. But when on that chart was the last group rolled out that we use today in food animals? What year? Yeah, I'll give you a hint. It's the year of the best high school class ever to graduate in the state of Kansas, 1978. Yeah. I know some older people that graduated then. I don't know. So yeah, it was 1978. So the last time we got a new class that we're using today in food animals, 1978. In 2018, that'll be how many years ago? 40 years. We've had new chemical alterations, but if there's resistance, it pretty quickly follows the alterations. So the take-home is, you can figure out the second part of that take-home. When do you think we'll get a new and novel class of antibiotics again for food animals? Yeah, don't hold your breath. Because if we get them, they're going to go to the human side. If there's any way they can be used in the human side. Tiamulin is not a medically important drug in the United States. It is, according to the World Health Organization, because there are now 2 forms of it which can be taken orally and are very effective for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus in humans. So I imagine we're going to see it switch to medically important in the U.S. when we revamp. I have no information for sure that that's going to happen, but I imagine we're going to see something like when we revisit that list. It already is, actually. So this puts everything we're going to talk about in context, because we get all wrapped around the axle about being blamed for human things and what's going on in human medicine, and there are some places we'll talk about where we're related. But the thing we better get over is thinking that that's the only issue, and it's not about protecting the use of these drugs for ourselves in food animals and in veterinary medicine. Because if you're thinking that that isn't an issue, you're dead wrong. Because we're not that far into this deal. Okay? AMDUCA still applies. Okay? That really started this in 1996. We got the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. And this gave us the legal right to use drugs off-label. We're talking here today about the Veterinary Feed Directive. We have never had the legal ability to use feed drugs other than as labeled. We have never had that legal opportunity. So if you're using a feed antibiotic in a way that's not specifically allowed on the label, you are breaking the law. That has not been enforced, because how do you know? Now, as we move into the veterinary feed directives, a veterinarian is going to have to make an FDA accessible record of what that drug was authorized to be used for, and in follow-up, the FDA may go to any site that a VFD copies at and investigate how it was used. So the transparency is going to be greatly increased on that. So what started this really down the path was looking at the new Veterinary Feed Directive Rule and 2 guidance documents called 209 and 213. The FDA speaks to us multiple ways, but 2 ways are through documents. Ones are the guidance for industry, which is a way of saying, here's what you should be doing. And another is compliance policy guidelines, which is really a public communication to their personnel on how they should enforce regulations and interpret regulations. This was a guidance for industry 209, and it said 2 really important things. The first is that use of medically important antimicrobial drugs, and we'll get to what those are, in food-producing animals should be limited to those uses that are considered necessary for the health of the animals, for assuring animal health. That means not for growth promotion. So that was the first big thing in there. Now, in setting up the reason for this, there's something new that started, is they started to use the word judicious, and they used the word stewardship, of which I cannot find any definitions in any type of, real definitions in any type of document or any type of regulation. Now, the word hazard is a regulatory term. If they would have used the word hazard in relation to human health, and there's regulatory cascades that they'd have to flow through. So by using the word judicious, they were able to put forth this voluntary document asking for voluntary compliance. So this is a little quote out of that. And it's a word that a lot of people really don't like in this country, or a phrase, is the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is written down, you can Google it from Europe, and it basically says if there is the potential for an event that would be wide-ranging, I'm paraphrasing, and catastrophic, and that if it gets rolling, it would be very difficult to stop. If there's enough information to say that could happen, then you are justified in not nipping that in the bud, withdrawing that product, prohibiting that practice until it can be shown to be safe. So what the precautionary principle does is flip it so that you're now responsible for showing there's no harm, rather than an agency saying, okay, we think there is harm, it needs to be withdrawn. Really, this language at the end is really, I think, regulatory speak for that classic line in Blazing Saddles, which actually first came from Treasurer of the Sierra Madre. We don't need no stinking badges. Okay. All right. Now, some of you younger people in the audience, especially you young men that want to know about being smooth, I took my wife on our first date to see Blazing Saddles. So, yeah. She's still around 34 years later, so it works. Smooth, always smooth, yeah. So, well, what is medically important? We said medically important, right? So what is medically important? Well, there's a list, and there's several lists out there. The World Health Organization has one that talks about their view of what's medically important. And then we have one in the United States, and it's in a document called Guidance for Industry 152, which is about assessing microbial risk for these products. And it's in Appendix A, and it came out in about 2000. And so the World Health Organization has a prioritization, and they pick out 4 groups as being especially critical for therapy in human use. And that's the glycopeptides, which vancomycin we mentioned. We don't have those labeled for food animals in the United States, and they are prohibited from extra label use in food animals. The fluoroquinolones, which you'd know as the trade name Baytril, enrofloxacin, or for cattle, Advocin, danafloxacin. The cephalosporins, which for us are the ceftiofur, the 3rd generation, and for dairy cattle we have cephalosporin, the 1st generation cephalosporin. And of course, they are prohibited from being used in an extra label regimen. You can use them for an off-label indication, but you can't use an off-label regimen. Fluoroquinolones are prohibited from all extra label use in food animals. So sometimes there's confusion. You say, well, enrofloxacin Baytril has strep suis on the label, so you can use it on strep suis in nursery pigs for brainers or paddlers or whatever, or joints. No, it's strep suis with respiratory disease. So use for strep suis not associated with respiratory disease is an illegal extra label use. And as we move forward, it's very important that everyone understands these things, because we're heading to a new era of transparency and antibiotic use in food animals, which are going to require us to make sure we've got all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. And of course, the macrolides, tylosin, Pulmotil, Micotil, those types of things. So these are ones that are not classified as medically important. So the ionophores are not, and of course to a room full of cattle people, that would be huge because of Rumensin, right? So it's not considered medically important. You're still going to be able to use it for growth promotion. We do have an ionophore now for swine. You're going to be able to use it for that, and it's not medically important, so it's not going to require a VFD. The bambamycins, bacitracin, carbadox, tiamulin, I mentioned that earlier. That one will be probably considered again in the future, although right now in the United States it is not classified as medically important, so will not require a veterinary feed directive to be used. Now, to be clear, when one of these is used in a legal combination, which is the only way you can use it, with another feed additive drug requiring a VFD, these will have to be included on the VFD with the veterinarian authorizing concurrent use. You don't have to go into all the specifics about number of animals, those things, but you do have to authorize concurrent use as a veterinarian, so they will be on some. So the other thing about that's going along with the VFD changes is that Guidance 209 also says, which we'll come back to in a minute, that all remaining uses of medically important antibiotics in food animals will be under the guidance of a veterinarian. The veterinarian will be authorizing those uses in feed or water. So the things that are left out today are going to the feed store and buying a bottle of Penji or LA200 or something like that, or a pig pump. You can do that, but those are probably fairly short-lived. But water medications will now all require a prescription, even for the label uses. Right, so they will require a prescription. Penicillins are medically important. Fluorophenocal is medically important, and of course already prescription status in the water, but those all will require that. All of our macrolides, you know, and of course palmitil currently requires a VFD in swine and cattle. So would Tilmavet. You need to understand that a VFD is not appropriately referred to as a prescription. We use the term prescription and saying it's like a prescription because a veterinarian's giving you a document that authorizes the use. The difference is if I write you a prescription for a bottle of Naxel, okay? I write you a prescription for that, it's going to have to be filled by someone who is authorized in the state of Kansas, in our case, to dispense that drug on behalf of an order from a licensed veterinarian. And in different states it's different. It's the pharmacy board, it's licensed as a distributor, but there has to be a license there that says I can distribute on the order of a licensed veterinarian. A licensed veterinarian can't distribute on the order of another licensed veterinarian because we're not pharmacists. Now the VFD is different in that when it was brought forward by Congress, Congress was very clear that it's not a prescription because they wanted to make it so that there was an increased ability to distribute those drugs so that someone just has to send a letter to the FDA and say, we're going to sell VFD drugs based on a VFD coming from someone. So then the FDA knows there's someone I can go check and see their VFD records. So milk replacers of feed. So when you go to your farm supply store next time, go look at the labels on a lot of the milk replacer in the store. And although it's not needed at all and makes no difference, they all are medicated. Okay? And that's one of those uses. I don't know why we do it. We do it because Grandpa did it, and we don't need to do it. But that is a medicated feed, and for January 1, 2017, for them to sell that, they are going to have to be on record with the FDA to receive VFDs and dispense a VFD feed on the basis of a valid VFD. So that's one change that will happen there. The sulfonamides are all medically important, and of course the tetracyclines. So here's the second principle, and that's that all medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals are limited to those uses that include veterinary oversight or consultation. So that's the veterinarian taking charge. So there's just some of those things at the feed store that'll change, won't change actually. The medicated milk replacer down here will. The water meds will require a prescription, which is a totally different process for the person distributing that than what it'll take to do the medicated milk replacer. This involves a letter to the FDA saying we're going to do it. This involves meeting requirements of your state pharmacy board. So radically different things for those two things. And these, right now, still over the counter, true or false? To buy a bottle of Pen G at your local feed store and go home and give a sow 5 cc's per 100 pounds IM requires a prescription. I got some truths. Everyone else? Well, Pen G in a sow's... Yeah, it's extra label use, so you have to have that prescription. Yep. Yep. So and if you do that without a veterinarian involved and there's a residue, then things are tougher, even than if a veterinarian was involved, because that was illegal extra label use of a layperson outside a veterinary client-patient relationship. So 213 gets referenced a lot, but that's the roadmap for getting 209 done. And the carrot was, for the companies, if you remove growth promotion uses from the labels, add the requirement for veterinary oversight on ones that are affected by 209, then that's what will change. We're not going to go back in and look at the environmental safety technical section. We're not going to look at the efficacy technical section. We're not going to look at microbial safety efficacy section, or microbial safety technical section within the human food safety. We're just going to change those. So that's 213 is the one that allowed to do that. So you can go to a site, if you Google GFI 213 updates on the FDA CVM site, or go there and search it. There's a site that every 6 months is updated with every label that's affected and whether they've been withdrawn, modified, or what they're doing with them in the process. So we talked about that. So that was kind of the carrot to get those done. So there were 283 labels, 26 companies. All of them agreed to do that. So it's done. So the VFD rule. There was some confusion on this. I got some interesting calls towards the end of October where some feed mills were saying, we can't do chlorotetracycline for you in the feed anymore. No, okay. So the new VFD rule took effect October 1 of this year, but that only applies to drugs that are VFD labels now, the ones that are currently a VFD label. So there's some alterations, and now that's handled, and we'll go through those changes. The majority of the drugs which are affected will be late December 16 or by January 1, 2017, and they're going to try to phase in those labels in kind of a package, so we don't have to change some in the summer, so that we get into it and we make the change pretty uniformly. So we have some alterations in the Veterinary Feed Directive rule that are in effect now, and we're going to have a lot of more drugs coming under the VFD rule the end of 2016. So the thing to understand about VFD status, it is about the label. It's about that drug's label. So the FDA, Center for Veterinary Medicine, has to work with each company to alter their label. And the FDA actually approves labels rather than the drug. Okay, they approve the label. So here's some things. VCPR. There's been some confusion on this because in the draft document, they took out the veterinary client-patient relationship and said supervision or oversight to try to completely leave it to the states. They realized that was a mess. So in the final rule, they came back and put in the veterinary client-patient relationship, and they're looking at each state, and if the state has a standard that's sufficient, it's the states. There's about 3 or 4 states which don't have a VCPR in their Practice Act or some kind of regulation, and in those cases it defaults to the VCPR definition, basically what's in the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. And that requires the veterinarian to have knowledge of the production setting. It requires them to be available for follow-up in case of a problem. There's several things in there that we have to have in effect for this to happen. One of the really key things that's been clarified is that means a licensed veterinarian, and that means licensed in the place the animals reside. So just because I'm licensed in Kansas doesn't mean I can write a VFD for pigs in Oklahoma, Missouri, or Nebraska. I have to be licensed in those states in order to do that. So who keeps the original copy has changed. In the original VFD rule, any drug that was a VFD drug was automatically a Category 2, meaning that it could only be mixed to the final feed in a licensed feed mill. So now that's not true. It'll be by label. And the definition for a Category 2 is if in at least one species the lowest dosing regimen requires a withdrawal time, it shall be a Category 2. So that's how they're going to be set, but it's not automatically a Category 2. It used to be that the original went to the feed mill and that's where it stayed. Now the veterinarian keeps the original because since not every drug will automatically be Category 2 and go to a licensed feed mill, the veterinarian should be the one holding that original because then you can go find it. You always know they have the original. Now, they can be done in two ways, a handwritten document, or they can be done electronically. And electronically means it's done in a way where there's a standard for having an authorized electronic signature. The veterinarian does that, electronically signs it, it's authorized to do that, and then that's transferred. An electronic format does not mean doing it and then scanning it and sending that. Electronic means done electronically with an electronically valid signature. So the veterinarian now keeps the original. One of the things that's causing the feed mills some grief is that they went back to requiring that all of these be kept for 2 years. So a licensed feed mill has to keep other forms for a year, and now they're going to have to keep these for 2. And in the draft rule, it was 1, but they went back to 2, which is causing some interesting comments in the industry. The VFD is about type B and type C feeds. It is not about type A's. If you purchase a type A, though, and you're going to put it in animals, you have to have a VFD to put it in the animals. But as far as transport and commerce of type A's, the VFDs are about premixes or final complete feeds that go into the animal. That's what it's about. Here's a question that's fairly common, and anyone who does feeds knows that there's multiple examples of where milligrams per pound per day for the animal and grams per ton don't match. I know some lawyer in the Beltway said they match, but they don't match. So we were asking them the question, so which one do you want us to do? You want us to do the grams per ton and be off on the milligrams per pound per day, or milligrams per pound per day and be off on grams per ton? We're waiting for a guidance on that, clear guidance. You want to talk about a challenge, you go to the cattle side with anaplasmosis. And the doses that are authorized are not adequate in cases, I'm told by veterinarians, quite a few cases to control anaplasmosis in the herd. We've got a problem because the only way is to fortify the mineral, which will be illegal, is illegal now, but we'll be having an authorization trail through a VFD, and any of you who are associated with cattle in this part of the world know that in some herds, if we don't have CTC in them in the fall, we lose cows and bulls. So that's on the cattle side going to be a real issue for us. Okay, expiration versus duration. There's two things in the VFD rule. There's the expiration of the VFD, and there's the duration that the drug is fed. So the duration is strictly specified on the label. If it says 10 days, you don't feed it for 9, you don't feed it for 11, you feed it for 10. And that's what they're going to be looking for. The expiration is how long your VFD authorizes the use of that feed. The expiration will be specified on the label of the drug. I cannot write it for anything different. If it is not authorized on there, there's going to be a default time that the veterinarian can write the VFD to be in effect for up to 6 months. And those of you who go with Palmitil now know that there's an expiration date on there, right? So you can write them for so long. We are hoping that they give us a lot of standardized days, okay? Because the expiration for Palmitil in cattle and swine is different. So is it going to be, you know, the worst case scenario would be to have some that are 90, 180, 45, 50, 62 and a half. You know, so we're hoping that doesn't happen so that veterinarians and producers can work out a standard reauthorization cycle to reevaluate and reauthorize it. Refills are technically authorized if on the label. I'm told by the FDA that don't expect any on the label. Okay? So it would take a new VFD. And then there's another interesting little thing. In cattle, CTC is 5 days, and it's very common practice to pulse. I'm sure we're not the only ones that do that. So we take a break and pulse, take a break, pulse. Okay? So the question was asked at a meeting, well, how do you do that? And I was thinking, well, if it's 100 head and you're going to do it 3 times, you write it for 300 head. Well, the initial reaction back was, no, that would take 3 different VFDs. So we're working through that. And this is just the way it is, and I'm preaching to the choir here. When we get new regulations and you actually start thinking about how we're going to implement these at the level of the animal, all these things pop out. And the good thing is we're starting to work through these about a year in advance, over a year in advance of when these happen. I've heard some people say that the FDA's waiting out there to make some big examples, and I just don't believe that's true at all. I think they realize we're all going to have to work in this together and figure some things out. For one of the things they're trying to evaluate is how we transition labels and stocks of earlier labels that survive through, and they're working on how we do that. That brings up a question of, my VFD is expired, but I still have feed. What do I have to do? You need a new VFD before you can feed that. I'm supposed to be feeding this for 10 days. My VFD has 5 days left on it, and I want to start feeding it. Okay, to finish it, I need a new VFD. If that VFD feed is being fed, there needs to be a valid VFD in place at the time it's being fed. You can't start it and then let it run out. So those are some of the things we'll work through. So what's next? So we've done the VFD thing. We've got medically important antibiotics. January 1, 2017, growth promotion use of antibiotics are going to go away. So what's next? What do we need to do next? Well, they're talking to us again through some documents. And on the FDA CVM website, there's a page just on veterinary feed directives. And if you want to learn, probably a lot of you have been there, if you want to learn more about it, there's guidance for Industry 120, which is a series of questions and answers. There's pamphlets that are designed for veterinarians, veterinary students, producers, and feed distributors that you can read. And there's also this document called Fact Sheet, Veterinary Feed Directive Final Rule and Next Steps, which says these 2 things. They think that long-term or open-ended use of medically important antibiotics is a significant stewardship issue, and that also it's not consistent with judicious use principles. Notice they're using the words stewardship and judicious, because they're going at this, starting to ask for voluntary compliance and moving forward. I feel we're heading into an area of where we are now going to be regulated with an industry, or an agency definition of judicious and stewardship. And this is a real clear indication of that. So these are uses, another way I've heard it talked about is these are uses which are inherent to the nature of the production system. So it's a disease that's just part of the production system. So one of the examples would be feedlots and liver abscesses. It could be a disease outbreak that's classic to a certain production phase for which an antibiotic use in the feed for extended periods or water is a standard practice. So those with no limit, no defined period of how long it's administered. So this is very clear that this is where they're heading next in addressing antibiotic use in food animals. So speaking of that, this is a picture of the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria. I have the opportunity to serve on that as one of the 15 voting members. Dr. Peter Davies from University of Minnesota is also on there. Dr. Randy Singer from University of Minnesota. Dr. Liz Wagstrom is a liaison on there from the pork board. So we have quite a few people that are on there with some ties to agriculture and understanding of that. It has been a really fascinating experience. There's people that do the same thing I do on the human side, antibiotic applications, worried about things like that. We've had our first public meeting in September. Our next public meeting will be in March. I am co-chair of one of the working groups, and we are working for that next meeting to go out in our 5 major key areas and find out what's going on both the human side and the veterinary side in those areas, which we'll talk about here. So it's been a really fascinating experience so far, and I'm sure it'll continue to be that way. So this was created in September 2014, presidential order directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services, consultation with Secretary of Ag, to create this group. And there are, these are some of the key things. So one of them that I've highlighted there is to develop alternatives to the use of antibiotics for some agricultural purposes. Agriculture is listed in it. There's something I hear from people that, well, ag's getting all the blame and human health's just kind of like, well, it couldn't be further from the truth. We are being looked at for our relationship on some of the specific pathogens, but they're taking a really hard look at themselves in human medicine too, looking at stewardship programs and what they need to do. There's some fascinating studies that really just show human nature is present everywhere. In one study, they worked really hard to evaluate how judiciously medical practitioners, human medical practitioners, were prescribing antibiotics, so giving amoxicillin for a cold or something like that. And a lot of the bronchitis that we get as humans is viral. The antibiotics do nothing for it. But when we go in coughing and our chest hurts, we expect an antibiotic. So they're working on telling us, go to bed, drink fluids, take some ibuprofen, you don't need it, call us back a couple, 3 days, right? So they monitored that, and they found that once you get to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, stewardship kind of goes down the old window. Human nature. Then one group of pediatricians, they were really focusing on not just giving an antibiotic out to every kid with any kind of respiratory signs. They monitored for a year, did 6 months of an intense program on stewardship, education, immediate feedback on prescribing, long-term feedback on prescribing. And in the group that received this versus the other one, inappropriate prescribing went from 30% down to 20%. Just 6 months, clear as a bell. They ran out of money to keep that going, so they could keep monitoring but not keep the interventions going. What do you think happened? 6 months, right back where it was. So you know what? We're all people. Right? So it's really interesting when you look at that. So the strategy of the CARB, one is slow the emergence and prevent the spread of resistant bacteria. So I'm the vice chair of that, along with a doctor who's on faculty at Johns Hopkins and is responsible for their stewardship program. And I'll just say I've really, really enjoyed that interaction with that working group so far. Identify and report cases of antibiotic resistance, so they're looking at how they can monitor and be aware of where resistance is coming forward. And of course, for us, it's NARMS. The CDC has some fascinating programs that are really revealing of what's going on. Diagnostics, basic and applied research and development of new antibiotics. My favorite question at any meeting with the human folks is, what do you think would happen in people if we started dosing on a milligram per kilogram basis? No response. So, and then international collaboration, I'm on that group, and we're looking at trying to really learn and understand what's gone on in other countries and any real or perceived or ill-perceived effects on human health and animal health, et cetera. So, and as well as in people, stewardship initiatives in people, so fascinating stuff. So, where to from here? I don't think sales of antibiotics for food animals are going to change significantly due to 209 and 213. If you look at cattle, our number one growth promoter that completely dominates are the ionophores, not affected by it. There's the option to alter doses in swine or poultry. We're not going to have much of a baseline, if any. So I have a hard time, if they're just looking for reduction in numbers, I don't know if 209 and 213 are going to do that, which is going to mean that we're going to be looking at people saying, well, that didn't reduce, what do we do next? End user antimicrobial use evaluation. That's where we're headed. We're headed for transparency in our use as industries. And I will tell you, I firmly believe it is absolutely in our best interest to come up with systems that allow us to benchmark and learn from what everyone else is doing, rather than let it get crammed through Congress and we get told how we're going to be evaluated, and then the data are just out there. I can tell you that as a species, Homo sapiens is today capable of gathering much more data than they are capable of evaluating. Okay? And one of the biggest problems is we're really good at numerators, but we stink at denominators. The denominators are the hard work. And activist groups hate denominators. Because the worst thing you can do when you're trying to hammer a food supply and you're talking about instances of foodborne disease or the rare cases of resistance in the food chain, the worst thing you can do is put a denominator under it and put those in context. We do have challenges, but the denominator puts it into context. Can't hold your finger there. And we already talked about that. Routine prevention control will be the next highly scrutinized use. So here's what the veterinary profession is looking at. We are not only going to be responsible for almost all antibiotic uses in food animals now, we're also going to be accountable. The veterinarians are looking at. So what are we using that we're going to be accountable for, right? What is it that we're using? And why would anyone get wound up about this? Well, if you go look at the 2013 AMDUCA data, cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones, less than 1%. Remember, those were way up high in the WHO ranking and are very critical for human use. Actually, it's, for both of those, it's down around 0.2 to 0.1% of total sales. They're really very small. There's our dominant one right there, the tetracyclines at 71% of medically important by weight, which, okay, it's a whole nother conversation about metrics and how we evaluate uses, and it depends if you want to actually understand the uses in the industry or if you want to use it as a stick. Okay? There's two completely different reasons for wanting metrics. Medically important, 74% of the total kilogram sales reported is through the feed, 21% is through the water. Add those up, about 95% of the uses are through the feed and water of medically important antibiotics by kilograms sold with a food animal label in the United States. It's about 95%. If you go down over here, here's the medically important and the percent changes. If you add up the percent changes from 2009 through 2013, we're up 16% in total sales, and that's the ones that are labeled with a food animal label. And if you want to go by dispensing status, over-the-counter, prescription, combination, and veterinary feed directive, right now, the medically important drugs, 98% are over-the-counter, requiring no veterinary authorization. That does not pass the front page of the newspaper test, and that is going to be, that's one of the big drivers for the VFD and that kind of deal. What are we using in pigs? CTC and OTC are about 2/3 of our estimate of in-feed use that we published in 2012. Tylosin comes behind. For growth promotion, from reporting in the 2006 swine study and other surveys we did, about 15% was growth promotion, about 40% prevention, about another 45 or so for therapy. Uses is reported, reasons for use. How do we compare to human use for antibiotics? So these are 2011 data. If you look at cephalosporins, we use about 26,000 kilograms. Human medicine uses about 500,000. Okay, a lot of cephalosporins. If you look at penicillins, we're 885, they're about 1.5 million. You look at sulfas and TMP for humans, about, this would be potentiated sulfas primarily over here for humans, us straight sulfas, but for even then, here's a whole long list of ones that we don't even use in food animals. There's that colistin, they don't use very much. If they're using that on you, yeah, you make sure you got things in order. Aminoglycosides, we dominate. Food animals, about 214,000 kilograms, about 6,500 for human. Lincosamides, we dominate. They'd be using primarily clindamycin or something like that. Macrolides, we dominate. And then there's the tetracyclines, about 5.6 million kilograms to about 113,000 kilograms. So tetracyclines dominate in food animal use, and we use a heck of a lot more than anything in human use. So that's really the ones that dominate. You hear that 80% number. If you take out the ionophores, it's actually about 75%. With the ionophores in, we're about 80% of total use from humans and animals that are in animals. So you go, well, how does that correlate to how many animals we have? So this is a highly scientific deal that took me the back of 4 envelopes to do. But it kind of gets you in there close. So these are 2011 human population was estimated at about 311 million, all right? Of which 119 million have some form of an SUB. Cattle and dairy calves, about 90 million, 110 million hogs slaughtered. And then I did conversions to say, okay, pigs, they weigh this much. The statistical human, how much do you think the statistical human now weighs in the U.S.? About 156 pounds, I think, is the statistical human. They don't get out. Turkey, poults, eggs, broiler-type chickens, 9 billion. Okay, chickens dominate in numbers. So if you go and do some human equivalence deals, here's how I did them. So I did slaughter hogs equal to the weight of 2 people with 2 turns per year, so the number stays the same, you know. These are human equivalent, right? And so you do human equivalent, and we're about 10 million to 648. Human equivalent about 648 million. So we're about 2 to 1. Drug use is pretty close to 2 to 1, a little over 2 to 1. So when you actually do human equivalence, it comes out pretty similar. But anyway. So this is what we're talking about, the basics, to kind of round up here and give us time for questions. This is clinical pharmacology in 4 fingers. So I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and I always have to boil things down to one hand that I can repeatedly review driving to work so I can remember stuff. And this is one of them. Can I do some good? Can I do any harm? Can I get it in the animal, and how much does it cost? That's what we do every time we think about putting an antibiotic or a drug in a food animal, right? And so the can I do any harm is what we're talking about, not only to the animal, but to our ability to treat animals in the future, or ability to pass something on through the food chain. So in human medicine, what are the resistance challenges? You can go to that 2013 CDC report, and if you actually look down through here, a lot of the challenges have nothing to do with food animals. Okay. There's ones, MRSA, the MRSA in pigs and people. The MRSA in pigs can colonize people, but to cause disease, it's not happening to any extent at all. There's like 2 cases they can cite in Denmark, but when you put a denominator under that, it's infinitesimal. Right? So that's an example, and the most frustrating thing to me is to see this next number over here, the 2 million cases and 23,000 deaths, and then automatically talk about, just like the recent pediatrician report, saying we get all these deaths, and let's talk about food animal use. When you start looking back through to ones we may have a part of, it's a fraction of that. So my take home is, if this is resistance issues in humans, we're probably that much of it. Okay? To say we have no part of it is wrong. To say that we're the major driver in resistance issues in human medicine is just as wrong. Okay? There's pieces there that we have to take ownership of. Clostridium difficile is becoming a huge problem in humans. 250,000 cases a year, 14,000 deaths. The C. diff we're dealing with today is nastier, meaner, and more aggressive than the C. diffs years ago, but this is a common problem, especially in hospitalized patients after being on antibiotics. It's a resistant organism. The antibiotics take out the competition, it overgrows, and it produces a lot of toxins. So that's where we are. In food animals, Mannheimia hemolytica, pea malt in cattle is a problem. Strep suis, E. coli in pockets in the swine industry. It's not everywhere, but we see some changes, and I talk to people that are running into some that have some significant resistance patterns. This is some published data looking at strep suis, and these are the MIC90s for ceftiofur, and it jumps from a 90% of the population being inhibited at 0.06 to 1 during 2001 to 2010. Penicillin went from 0.25 to 1, and you can look and see it start to walking across with some MIC changes. So that means there's some isolates out there that are becoming resistant. So again, it's not just about humans, it's about our ability to do it. So I want to close with this slide and have time for some questions. But I want to talk to you about what's stewardship, okay? What is stewardship? This previous slide, let's go back to it. That's the Infectious Disease Society of America definition of stewardship. And in that, it's really, really focused on hospitals. On the human side, there's something called the Center for Medicare Services, CMS. And CMS protocols dominate in how hospitals do things. So they can say, thou shalt do this with sepsis, and that's what they do if they want to get their Medicare payments. Right? We don't do that on veterinary side and production animal medicine, we're like community practice in humans. So there's some challenges in trying to take this and extrapolating it directly across to us. So what is stewardship? I think the first thing about stewardship for us is there a non-antibiotic alternative which will appropriately prevent, control, or treat this disease challenge? The hour before me was an example of non-antibiotic alternative of understanding the physiology in those pigs and doing it right by that. Then if there's not an option, selection of an antibiotic which has been demonstrated to be safe and effective for this purpose, while assuring use of the antibiotic is shown to be safe and effective. That means records and protocols. Records and protocols, records and protocols. The days of no records and verbal treatment protocols are gone. They're done. While asking this question again. And actually, if you wanted to define what a VCPR, I think that's a VCPR. That veterinarian has enough of a relationship with the person they're prescribing for that they know this. They know that it's being used as it's supposed to be used and that we're getting some value from it. I think you can talk all you want about writing protocols and all this flowery stuff, but if the veterinarian can't answer me questions about that, I don't think it's a VCPR. And unfortunately, one of my concerns is that the VFD is going to spawn yet another cottage industry of script bunnies. Those are veterinarians that can't make a living as veterinarians, so they go around and write prescriptions for a few bucks. So anyway, these are just a couple of things that are broken that we need to fix as far as clinical pharmacology, et cetera. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Yeah. We can talk about anything about pharmacology you might get in, I don't know.
Mike, I got the first one. We were fortunate to hear this today. How's the educational effort going in terms of all the veterinarians? Mike, can you repeat? Okay, the question was, how's this going for all the veterinarians? We have a range of veterinarians that have probably heard something like this 4 or 5 times that are, this year, if you go to the swine veterinarians, you go to the bovine practitioners, you go to the Academy of Veterinary Consultants, you go to state meetings, there's going to be training opportunities and interactive training. And we've got the range to veterinarians that aren't sure what a VFD is yet. So we've got a range to deal with. I think our activity in that's going to get pretty heavy next year. Yes, sir.
How do I know whether the
So the question was, how will the feed mill or a distributor know that the veterinarian is writing a valid VFD by being licensed in that state? You're going to have to ask. If you don't know them, you're going to have to ask to confirm that they're licensed in that state. The best thing that can happen for us is to have, there's some that are getting there, some electronic formats for doing the VFDs where the only way you can get the VFD written is to select from drop-down boxes for legal applications, label indications, durations, expirations, everything. So that when a mill or a distributor gets a VFD through that system, they go, I know that's legal. Yes, sir.
Where's the funding that come from to A, keep the system that you just described running, or B, have the manpower and labor to send people out to these people to test the feeds to
Okay. So the question was two-part. Number one is the dollars for doing the VFD and the systems, and number two is the dollars for auditing and enforcing. So when I talk to rooms full of producers and they ask who's going to pay for this, my answer is you. Okay? But quickly behind that is the response that if you're working with a veterinarian that can't provide you value for the cost of that relationship, you need to find another veterinarian. Because there's a lot of veterinarians out there who can provide you that value. And number two, about enforcement and stuff like that, good question as to where those types of dollars are coming from. Our entire first public meeting on the combating antibiotic resistance, resistant bacteria council, was listening to government agencies coming in about what they're doing, and the common theme was we're way short on cash to do what we need to be doing. Yes, sir.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the industry for the work.
Thank you.
It's good and great for the industry. It's probably the biggest issue that we have. Yet, the feedback I get from retailers is that's a good first step. What's next?
Yeah, so the question is from feedback from retailers, good first step, what's next? You hit another, we got another hour or so? So there's three people that are driving how we're going to use antibiotics in the future. Regulation, legislation, retailation. That's the retailers. And, you know, there's a thing called the Overton window that talks about how things move from unthinkable in a population to policy. And it gradually becomes more and more acceptable and then becomes policy. You know, and so you start talking, prohibiting the use of antibiotics for growth promotion is now policy, right? So is there any place where prohibiting the use of antibiotics for treating diseased animals is policy? What's it called? It's called never ever an organic. That's what organic is. You're prohibited from using an antibiotic to treat an ill animal. So that's already there, and so we've got retailers that are using that to say we're gonna move to completely antibiotic free, right? And the concept is out there that since you can take some chicken flows and raise them without antibiotics, we're just using them needlessly in swine flows, cattle flows, and turkey flows, for example, right? That's something we're working very hard to educate on, and I know the pork industry, beef industry, veterinary groups are trying very hard to engage with the retailers and get on the same page as far as realistically what's going on. I hope we can get to the point, there's a process verified program out there for responsible use of antibiotics in poultry, and frankly, I don't think they've missed it by that far. It's about the veterinarian being involved, used in it for treatment. When you have to routinely use it for prevention, we need to figure out why. And then it's audited by the USDA. In my way of thinking with the retailers, right now some of them feel there's only no change or never ever as the options. Our job is to give them a very responsible place in the middle. That's where we've got to end up. Yes, ma'am.
I think we're embracing the whole concept of it, but when
And so the question is, you're into a VFD and you want to change halfway through, by law, you're supposed to finish it. That's just like the extra label prohibition use for cephalosporins. What they've done is say you can use it for an off-label indication, but as a veterinarian, you're prohibited by law from altering the dose to appropriately treat the other indication. You know. So the issue you're hitting on. Right, right. And what you're doing is talking about de-escalating, where you go, that's the wrong thing, we don't need to do that, we want to stop. It's another thing we've got to talk with them about. So these blanket rules and regulations sometimes get in the way of what you're describing as judicious use. I think, so judicious use, and then one of the biggest things there, I think, is the concept of stewardship. Stewardship involves veterinarians working with producers to do everything they can to avoid the need for the antibiotic. And then I think being judicious with it is once we say we've got to use it, but the thing about stewardship and systems change going 20 to 30 years in the future with no new antibiotics is focusing on doing everything we can to not have to use them.
One more.
Yes, ma'am.
How do we know we're following the right protocol? Like, we have an internal mill just for our own hogs. How do I know we're doing things right? Like, for example, we're following the good manufacturing protocol with that documentation. And a gentleman came in our office last week and said that we needed to hire him to get us certified on the safe feed, safe food thing. And so I think there's a lot of confusion out there. I mean, if we're doing, I mean, we want to be right, but what is really required?
And so the question is, how does like an internal mill know that they're doing things right? Licensed? You know, yeah, so a licensed internal mill's got a whole series of things you've got to do to maintain that. If there's some other type of certification, it'll be out there for us to learn about. But for right now, the documentation associated with the VFDs that are coming will be very clear. A licensed mill has definite things they've got to document and retain. And then as far as these VFD drugs, if the use is exactly according to label, you're good. If the use is deviating from label, you're not.
So we don't, this other thing that he was describing, that's not required as far as you know.
I may be missing something. There's other people more familiar with that. But yeah.
Call Charles.
Yeah, call Charles there. Yeah. Anyway, we better quit, but thanks a lot.
Mike Apple is going to be all the business.